Marketplace Kai Rizdal interviews Donald Rumsfeld on his new book, Rumsfeld Rules. And he's only got, a fairly short interview. And very quickly, he moves into Rumsfeld rules after Rumsfeld talks about some of the rules he has about, not doing any nation building and not invading improperly countries that, let's just listen.
So let's start with this one. It's easier, you say, to get into something than it is to get out of it. And I can't help but wonder where we would be in this country today if you guys had been thinking of that 10 years ago.
Well, I thought of that actually when I was President Reagan's Middle East envoy, and we had 241 Marines killed in Beirut at the airport. And I concluded then that the United States has to be careful about putting ground forces in because we're such a big target. And I also,
pause it for a second,
over the years came to the conclusion that...
Now, here Rumsfeld is sort of pretending like he doesn't know the question. He doesn't understand the question, and it's almost like he can't even believe that someone would actually ask him this question in this way. And then, of course, the reason not to put in ground forces may not have to do with anything other than we're a really big target.
The United States really wasn't organized, trained, and equipped to do nation building. So if you think of Afghanistan...
hang on a minute. I sort of can't believe these words are coming out of your mouth now 10 years later. This was on your mind as Iraq was burbling up?
Absolutely.
And yet here we are.
Well, in Afghanistan, we had 23,000 troops in there, as I recall, when I was there, and President Obama ran them up to close to 100,000. And the situation in Iraq, we had a relatively small footprint and changed the regime, which was the policy of the United States in the Clinton administration.
Wait a second. We had a relatively small footprint in Iraq? I think we had well over 160,000 troops at one point. Well, it's relatively. In other words, to get rid of all that stuff, that's a relatively small footprint. Now, he could also be saying that, with shock and awe, we blew up so much of the territory that you couldn't see our footprints.
But once you get a mission creep where people start attempting to do things well beyond that, that's obviously not something the Department of Defense is organized to do.
I will do you the favor, Mr. Secretary, of assuming that you're not trying to shift any kind of responsibility here.
Well, I'm not. It's just reality that when you do something, then someone wants you to do something else, and then something else, and over time, the mission is historically creeps into something other than was initiated at the outset.
And yet the primary critique, and I grant you, and as you well know, there have been many, the primary critique of the Bush administration in Iraq is that you guys went in without a plan to get out. And here we now are having a conversation where you say, I was thinking about all this stuff, but we went in anyway.
Well, if you go to my website, rumsfeld.com, you'll find 4,000 documents on there, and any number of them talk about these kinds of risks and problems. One of them was called The Parade of Horribles that I wrote well before the war and gave it to the president. And
what we're watching here is Donald Rumsfeld essentially trying to throw George Bush under the bus. And everyone else around him who supposedly, I just signed up to go in and invade and get out. Now, everybody else was telling me, blah, 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 that you got to stay in, you got to nation build in this. I never wanted to do that. I never wanted to do it. Now, I'm not trying to shift blame here, but go to my website, buy a book, and check out all the documents that really show that George Bush didn't listen to me.
The National Security Council members, it's not easy for countries to evolve and grow. But I think that both of those countries are a whale of a lot better off today than they were before. My book, of course, is not about Afghanistan.
No, of course
Iraq.
It's not. But
it's a bunch of rules.
Yeah, but you appreciate you can't have a conversation with Donald Rumsfeld about the rules he lives by without talking about these things, right?
Sure.
Yeah. All right, here's...
And folks, go listen to the rest of it. Sure, I get it. I wrote a My book was really just more about, like, what you should do when you're heading out, not when you're going in and killing hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians.
I like how he said, my book's about a bunch of rules. Just a bunch of...
Bunch of rules.
He was expecting a softball management culture interview and got the toughest interview I've heard besides Louis C.K.
Absolutely.
asking him if he's a reptile.
Exactly. And I imagine he will find a new publicist after this, or somebody who has, has the ability to tell him, like, Donald, maybe just like, maybe it's just time to just do a little more skiing or hanging out at the beach. You may not want to go out in public anymore. I hope that's the first of many interviews where we will hear Donald Rumsfeld and the rest of these war criminals have to account for themselves, because it's not going to come from our government.